The first shot never came. It only waited there in the heat, inside the crooked finger of a ranch hand with whiskey on his breath, while Dry Creek held itself, so still a person could hear the flies worrying the rim of the horse trough. Norah Vale stepped into the middle of Main Street before the men could finish deciding who would kill whom. She had arrived less than an hour earlier in widow black with one valise and a train coat powdered with soot. Now she stood between three armed ranch hands, the town sheriff, and a narrow man trapped against the porch of Kellum's Mercantile with a leather satchel under one arm. Sheriff Vance Talbot looked at her the way decent men look at disasters they do not yet understand. "Ma'am," he said, "move aside." Norah did not move. "Before we go any further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We always like knowing who has joined us when the door to a story opens." The ranch hand with the pistol was young, red-haired, and bleeding from the mouth. His hand shook from fury or fear. Norah had spent too many years on too many stages not to recognize the instant before a room tipped into violence. Breath changed first, then eyes. Then somebody made a choice they could never pull back. She looked at the man on the porch. Dark hair, sun-browned face, pale gray eyes that stayed calm in a way she did not trust, and yet instinctively respected. He wore a bookkeeper's coat, not a gunman's. Dust streaked his cuffs. There was blood on one sleeve that did not look like his. "If he meant to kill you," Norah said to the red-haired boy, her voice cool as creek water, "you'd be dead already." A murmur moved through the street. The trapped man spoke before anyone else could. "I stole the ledgers," he said. "I didn't cut the boy." That made the silence sharper, not softer. Why would a man steal ledgers instead of money? Why admit even part of it with 3 guns on him in broad daylight? Norah did not know the answers, but she knew the shape of truth when it entered a room carrying risk. Talbot's heavy jaw tightened. "Give me the satchel, Ortega." So he had a name. The man on the porch said, "If I hand it over, Harlan burns it before sundown." At that name, half the street seemed to flinch. Cyrus Harlan, biggest cattle owner in 3 counties. Holder of notes, deeds, water rights, and men. Norah had heard the name twice since stepping off the train. Once from the station master with admiration. Once from the depot sweeper with disgust, so quiet it had sounded like prayer. Then Harlan himself appeared at the far end of the street, descending from a black carriage with 2 mounted foremen behind him and 4 more riders coming hard from the south road. He was broad in the shoulder, silver at the temples, and dressed too well for a town where dust got into everything. He wore his power the way some men wore gloves, like something tailored. "What a pity," he said mildly as he approached. "My bookkeeper loses his mind the very day we have company. Sheriff, do end this." Ortega's jaw flexed. "Tell them why I took the books. Because you are a thief. Because you kept dead men on payroll and called them deserters so their widows never saw the wages. Because you altered debts after funerals and took land from women who could not read the fine print you changed." The words struck like stones thrown into still water. Faces along the boardwalk changed. A barber set down his razor. Mrs. Weller from the boarding house stopped with a basket on her arm. The red-haired ranch hand blinked as if the ground had shifted under him. Harlan did not look at Ortega. He looked only at Talbot. "Arrest him, and remove the lady before she embarrasses herself." That almost made Norah smile. 2 years earlier, she had been a praised contralto on the river circuit. Then a theater scaffold gave way during a scene change, and her husband Edwin died on the stage floor before the applause had drained from the walls. The owner sent condolences with money enclosed. Grief, priced and sealed. Since then Norah had learned that many powerful men mistook a woman in black for a woman already defeated. "If local business includes robbing widows," she said, "I imagine the embarrassment belongs elsewhere." That bought her a soft ripple of astonished laughter. Harlan heard it. His eyes settled on her at last, cold and blue and insulted by resistance. "Your name?" "Norah Vale." Something flashed across Ortega's face. Recognition, maybe. Harlan only said, "I suggest you take a room, unpack your trunk, and leave law to men better built for it." "And I suggest," Norah replied, "you not mistake a black dress for surrender." Then the church bell began ringing wild from the square. Not for service, not in pattern. Reverend Pike must have seen the riders and guessed what it meant. Heads turned. Horses tossed. The moment tore open. Ortega moved first. He knocked the pistol aside, dove off the porch, and ran. The shot shattered the mercantile window. Glass rained. Women cried out. Harlan's riders surged forward. Mara bent, snatched the fallen satchel from the dust, and ran after Ortega into the alley beside the dressmaker's shop before good sense had time to protest. By the time Sheriff Talbot shouted for them both to stop, her life had already split in two. The alley smelled of ash and cabbage water. Mara's boots slipped in mud by the pump. Ortega vaulted a stack of crates, turned back, and caught her elbow before she went headlong into them. "Why are you following me?" he snapped. "Because 6 armed men seem excessive for bookkeeping," she said, wrenching free. "And because you looked as though you had a reason." He stared at her one stunned beat, then jerked his head toward the stable yard. "This way." They burst past the boarding house chickens, cut behind the last stall, and slipped through a loose plank into a wash choked with rabbit brush. Only when the shouts dimmed did Ortega stop. "My name is Rafael Ortega," he said. "I kept Cyrus Harlan's books 11 years. That satchel holds wage records, false debt notes, and names of men Harlan worked into graves. If he gets those papers back, he buries the proof with them." Mara held the satchel tighter. "Why steal them alone?" A hard look crossed his face. "Because men who owe him their mortgages go deaf. Because the sheriff eats at his table. Because my mother lives in a shack on Harlan land, and asking other people to be brave for you is one of the quickest ways to get them killed." There it was. Not bravado. Cost. Mara knew something about costs handed to the wrong people. Since Edwin's death, she had been surrounded by gentleness so complete it felt like burial. Everyone had treated her as if usefulness belonged to her former life. As if a woman whose voice once filled a hall might reasonably be expected to go small and stay there. Boots pounded somewhere near the stable. Men were spreading out. The town was closing around them. Raphael drew a revolver and offered it grip first. "Take this and catch the north train. Give me the satchel and forget any of this happened." Mara looked from the gun to his face. "You have mistaken me for a sensible widow." That was the hope. She opened the satchel instead. 2 ledgers. Receipts. A sheaf of folded letters. In one column, names had been marked deceased in pencil and crossed out in ink, replaced with absconded. A dead man could not claim wages. A deserter did not deserve them. There was the whole rotten trick in 2 words. Mara shut the book. "No." Raphael frowned. "No. The easy road has had its turn with me." She lifted the satchel. "Where do these go if we mean for them to live till morning?" He studied her, as if revising a conclusion he had been certain of. "Judge Holloway rides circuit through here tomorrow for the land hearings. If these reach him first, they become official. But there is no safe place in town. Only the old mission by Cottonwood Creek. My mother keeps the key. Then we go there. You don't even know me. I know your enemy well enough." A stable hand shouted that he'd found tracks behind the stalls. Right then Mrs. Weller appeared at the mouth of the wash, blue apron and all, carrying her basket like a shield. She was a square little woman with floured forearms and a face sharpened by 30 years of boarding house opinions. "If either of you plan on dying for righteousness," she whispered, "wait till after you've listened. Harlan's men are circling the depot. Talbot's searching rooms at my place. And your mother, Raphael, sent word through my kitchen girl that she's already gone to the mission because she suspected you might do something dramatic before supper." Raphael closed his eyes briefly. "That sounds like her." Mrs. Weller turned to Mara. "You the singer?" "Formerly." "Nonsense. A bell doesn't stop being bronze because it's been cracked." She jerked her head toward the road. "My produce wagon's out front. Under the sacking. Both of you." That was the first unexpected loyalty, and it changed the day. They hid among onions and turnips while the wagon rattled through town. Through a tear in the burlap, Mara saw Talbot stop them in the street and heard Mrs. Weller ask whether the sheriff intended to search her potatoes for treason. Even Raphael, wedged close in the vegetable dark, nearly smiled. "You're hurt," she whispered. "Not badly. You lie neatly. Occupational habit." By the time they climbed out beyond the last house, the afternoon had gone hard and bright. Cottonwood Creek lay east through dry grass and scrub hills. They cut across country to stay off the road. Away from town, talking came easier. Raphael said his father had died under a fallen wall during flood repairs, and Harlan had docked the coffin from unpaid wages. Mara said Edwin built opera sets, and once told her high notes sounded expensive. That won a real laugh from him, low and surprised, and it warmed some quiet place in her she had not meant to offer anyone. The mission stood beyond a stand of cottonwoods, small and old and weathered pale. An older woman waited at the door with a shotgun across her palms. "You are late," she said to Raphael. "And you've brought trouble wearing gloves." "Mama, this is Mara Bell." The woman looked Mara over. "The singer." Mara almost stopped walking. "How does everyone know that?" Ines Ortega snorted. "My son carried your poster in his ledger for 3 years. Get inside. Night is coming, and idiots feel bolder after dark." Inside, the mission smelled of wax, old wood, and chilly smoke. A saint with half his paint gone watched over the room. Ines spread the ledgers on the table and read fast, lips tightening. "Enough to hang him," she said quietly, "if the judge sees them. That if sat in the room through supper and into night. Would you have trusted Raphael by then, if you were in Mara's place? A hunted man with steady hands and nowhere to spend his honesty, but at great personal cost? Or would you have called this whole thing madness and run? Tell me what you would have done, because that is the question at the heart of every hard story. When does another person's fight become your own?" Raphael stood watch by the window after dark. Coyotes called from the ridge. The creek whispered over stone. Moonlight silvered the scar running from his jaw into his collar. "They'll come tonight," Mara said. "Yes." He did not dress it up. Harlan doesn't rage. He arranges. If Talbot rides with him, law will knock first and fire will start after. And if they take the papers? Then my mother says she misplaced them. I say I forged them. Harlan says the town got confused. By next week nobody remembers a widow's name. Men like him count on memory tiring before cruelty does. That line stayed with Mara. From the table, Ines said, "There may be one chance." She nodded toward the little chapel beyond the kitchen wall. The old priest wrote that the ceiling carries sound strangely. A whisper under the apse leaps to the rafters. A hymn there can rattle dust from the beams. If horses panic, armed men start making poor decisions. Mara's pulse stumbled. She had not truly sung since Edwin died. Once alone, she had tried. The first note had cracked against his memory and left her bent over, unable to finish breathing. Silence had become first refuge, then habit, then a room she no longer knew how to leave. Raphael saw the change in her face. "No," he said immediately. "Forget it. Because I cannot. Because you should not have to." The gentleness of that landed deeper than command would have. Before she could answer, a horse whinnied outside. Then another. Wheels ground in the yard. Talbot's voice called from beyond the door that he carried lawful warrant. Raphael blew out the lamp. Everything narrowed. Ines hid the satchel under the floor hatch. Raphael checked his revolver. Mara took hold of the iron poker by the hearth because empty hands suddenly seemed like an indecency. The first blow shook the door. "Raphael Ortega," Talbot shouted. "Open in the name of the law." "Law keeps ugly company tonight," Mara murmured. The second blow splintered the latch. Then gunfire. Wood burst inward. Raphael fired once through the gap, and a man screamed outside. Powder smoke filled the room, bitter as pennies on the tongue. A bullet tore the saint's painted shoulder. Another shattered the water crock. Mara dropped behind the hearthstones, heard horses shrilling in the yard, heard Harlan's voice underneath the chaos, composed and terrible. The back window exploded. A hand thrust through. Mara swung the poker down hard. The hand vanished with a curse. "That was nearly music," Raphael said, not looking at her. Then something heavy hit the kitchen roof. Fire. Smoke crawled along the ceiling and thickened. Harlan called from outside, almost conversationally. "Give me the satchel, and I may yet leave survivors enough to regret this wisely." Raphael looked toward the hidden floor, then toward the chapel arch. No choice remained except the worst and truest one. "Mara," he said. He did not need to ask the rest. She ran into the chapel as sparks drifted from the kitchen beams. Moonlight pooled over cracked tiles. The bell rope hung dead and useless. For one terrible second, she could not remember how to begin. Edwin rose before her in memory, smiling backstage with sawdust on his sleeves. Grief closed its fist around her throat. Then Raphael grunted in pain from the other room, and outside Harlan ordered men forward like a man pricing cattle. Something in Mara broke loose. Not her fear, her refusal. She drew breath. The first note came out raw. The second found shape. By the third, the chapel seemed to wake around her. She did not sing gently. She sent the sound upward like judgment. A dark, Rich note rose into the curved ceiling and returned larger, then another and another, until the whole mission rang. The sound poured through the broken windows into the yard with such force the frames shuddered. Horses screamed. Men shouted. One animal snapped its tether and slammed sideways into the wagon. Another reared and threw its rider. Smoke rolled. Shadows lurched. The night itself seemed to recoil. Mara sang higher. Harlan's men had expected bullets, not a widow in black splitting the air open with her bare throat. Raphael burst from the smoke with his revolver in one hand, and the chapel side door flung wide with the other. Now, Mara kept singing as she backed through the door. Ines crawled from the trap and made for the creek wall with the satchel under her shawl. Through the churn of smoke Mara saw Harlan himself, coat over his mouth, fury blazing in his eyes. He raised his pistol toward her. Raphael saw it. So did Talbot, thrown in the dirt beside his panicked horse. Talbot fired first. One crack. Harlan's hand burst red, and the pistol spun away. For a second no one moved. Harlan stared at the sheriff in naked disbelief, as if betrayal were a privilege meant only for other men. Talbot got to his knees, face white with dust and shame. I saw the widow claims, he rasped. Signed to myself. Kept telling myself a man can eat one rotten meal and still call himself honest. He looked at the burning mission, the terrified horses, the town beginning to flood into the yard carrying buckets and blankets, and outrage. Turns out the rot was in me. Harlan lunged toward the dropped pistol. Raphael fired into the dirt an inch from his fingers. Don't. That was the first moment Cyrus Harlan ever looked mortal. People came from every direction then. Mrs. Weller in her apron. Reverend Pike with a bucket. The barber with shaving soap still ghosting one ear. Eli, the red-haired ranch hand, staring from Harlan to the satchel in Inessa's arms like a boy discovering the shape of the lie he had been living inside. Two widows stood at the edge of the yard with faces so hard and hungry Mara felt the whole case settle into history. Harlan looked around and found no shelter. Power depends on witnesses choosing comfort over truth. Too many in that yard had just been frightened out of comfort. Talbot stood, drew his cuffs, and crossed to him. Cyrus Harlan, you are under arrest for fraud, arson, theft, conspiracy, and whatever else those ledgers prove before sunrise. On whose authority? Harlan demanded. Talbot fastened the first cuff hard enough to make him flinch. On the authority of a man who got tired of being smaller than his badge. If this story is moving you, if you know what it means to watch decent people get pushed too far and still rise, then a like and a subscribe tells us to keep making room for stories like this. The fire was beaten down before it took the chapel roof. The stars remained pitilessly clear overhead, as though justice and ruin were equally ordinary from a great enough height. Much later, when Harlan was locked in the mission route cellar under Reverend Pike's watch and the wounded were bandaged, Mara sat on the back step with a wet cloth at her throat. The creek whispered nearby. Smoke drifted sweet and bitter through the cottonwoods. Raphael brought her coffee in a chipped cup and lowered himself beside her with the careful stiffness of a man only now beginning to feel where the bruises were. You stopped a gunfight with an aria, he said. I rather suspect it was uglier than that. It was the finest ugly thing I've ever heard. She laughed softly, then winced at her throat. It felt good to laugh and painful enough to make it honest. For a while they listened to the water. Then Raphael said, without looking at her, when I first heard you sing, I was 23 and foolish enough to think beautiful things arrived in the world untouched. Tonight, I learned beautiful things survive it. She turned that over in silence. It was the kind of line people keep. After Edwin died, she said, everyone told me my voice would come back when grief was finished. As if grief were weather. As if it moved on because the calendar asked nicely. She tightened the cloth at her throat. I thought if I sang again, it would mean I had agreed to live in a world that kept him dead. Raphael finally looked at her. Moonlight caught in his pale eyes. And now, Mara thought of the chapel answering her, of fear turning useful, of the note that had gone through her like fire finding old oil. Now I think being useful may be the first form of peace. He sat with that, then said quietly, do you remember a line printed on one of your posters? From the queen in the blue gown. She searched, then found it. Raphael said it with awkward reverence. What is broken can still be chosen. Her breath left her. He had kept that line all those years. Some younger version of her, not yet widowed, not yet hollowed out, had once meant courage to a stranger, and here he was placing it back in her hands when she finally understood its cost. She reached for him then, not dramatically, just hand to hand. Warm skin, split knuckles, ink caught in the lines of his fingers. "We've both spent too long asking permission from ruins," she said. His thumb moved once over her knuckles. Very gently. "Yes." From the doorway, Ines cleared her throat like a woman refusing to be left out of sentiment. "If either of you intends to fall in love, do it after you drink the coffee. I will not waste good beans on staring." They laughed then, both of them, small and startled and human after such a night. By sunrise, Judge Holloway had been fetched from the South Road. He was a hard-eyed circuit judge with dust on his cuffs and patience only for paper that could survive being doubted. He spent the morning at the mission table turning ledger pages while Harlan sweated in irons nearby, and Talbot gave a statement that did not once try to save his pride. The widows came one by one. Mrs. Cooper with a child on her hip. Alma Reed in the brown dress she'd worn to her husband's burial because black fabric cost more in Dry Creek. Lena Two Rivers, quiet as winter, who needed nothing explained to her about stolen wages, only where to put her name. Each account set another stone on the pile already waiting to crush Cyrus Harlan. By noon his accounts were seized. By evening the land transfers were stayed. Within the week federal auditors were sent for because Judge Holloway disliked the smell of wider fraud. Harlan's mine partner, a banker in Pueblo, and 2 foremen who had signed false rolls were all named. Contracts he had used to strangle smaller ranchers were voided. Men who had once tipped hats to him now stepped aside only to let the law pass. Justice, when it finally came, did not hurry. But it came with wagons. Talbot resigned before the week was out and testified anyway. "I don't deserve clean sleep," he told Mara once outside the jail. "Maybe I can earn tired sleep." Dry Creek changed in patches, then all at once. Mrs. Weller kept a free pot of stew for widows tangled in claims paperwork. Eli left Harlan's spread. Ines turned the mission patch into a garden that fed half the creek road. Mara had meant to leave on the next train east. Instead, she stayed long enough to help Judge Holloway organize affidavits. She read the widows' names aloud so none of them could blur into columns. Raphael sat across from her copying statements in his neat hand, sleeves rolled, his scar plain in the afternoon light. Their love did not come like lightning. It came like a lamp being lit in a house both had mistaken for empty. A second cup poured without asking. A hand at the small of her back on icy boards. The first evening she sang in the mission kitchen, low and rough and honest. Raphael stood still by the doorway, as if afraid gratitude might startle what had returned. He kissed her 3 weeks after the fire beside Cottonwood Creek, mud on his boots and ink on his thumb. It was not a young kiss. It was better. It was the kind that says I have seen the ruins and still I am here. By winter, Cyrus Harlan was convicted of fraud, arson, conspiracy, wage theft, and coerced debt seizure. His land was broken apart between creditors, families he had dispossessed, and widow claims. His accounts were emptied into restitution. His reputation collapsed into a warning. He did not retire in peace. He vanished into a prison ledger, which was fitting for a man who had spent years trying to make other people disappear inside one. When snow came, Mara turned the burned loft above Kellum's rebuilt mercantile into a music room for children. She taught girls who had been told to hush how to fill a wall with sound. Raphael took over the town accounts under Judge Holloway's recommendation and kept them so clean even gossip found nowhere to cling. Months later, on a blue evening with snow along the fence rails, Mara stood outside the schoolroom listening to children ruin an Italian chorus with heroic confidence, while Raphael fixed a stubborn window latch and pretended not to sing along. Ines shouted from the kitchen. Smoke rose straight from the chimneys. The creek ran dark under ice. Mara leaned into Raphael's shoulder, and he covered her gloved hand with his ink-stained one. "Strange," she said. "How the life you thought was over can be waiting in the last place you'd ever think to look." "Maybe that's mercy," he said. She watched the mission windows glow one by one against the snow. "No," she answered softly. "Mercy is when it waits long enough for you to recognize it." Years later, travelers passing through Dry Creek in winter would sometimes stop outside that little schoolhouse just to listen, because when Marabelle lifted her voice now the children joined her, and the sound that drifted into the cold was no longer grief trying to survive, but a whole town finally learning how to belong to the people it had once failed, while the mission bell answered softly over the creek. Next time, we'll tell the story of the scarred ranch cook everyone mocked for 20 years until the night a blizzard trapped the richest man in town under her roof, and he learned whose kindness had been keeping them all alive.